So in this video I'm going to go over cycles and Eevee in Blender. So we're going to see some differences between the two render engines and basically when to use which and basically what quality to expect from each other. So rendering engine is basically how how Blender will compute visuals in the editor or the viewport. Of course, this also is in respect to rendering. So when you are working in your project, you might be working in cycles, which give you the most accurate view of how your scene will look like when you render it. But you can see you have some downsides where it's kind of noisy and it's kind of hard to move depending on your graphics card. If you have an older graphics card, this is going to look way more choppy and laggy. But if you go to Eevee, it will be way more responsive, but it might not represent your scene accurately. Now, Eevee was a big step up for Blender because before you would kind of have this view, which is kind of more of a material view and does not represent scene that much. But Eevee kind of combined it with some different optimization techniques, so you can actually showcase ambient occlusion, you can actually showcase reflections and stuff like that. So we can see what the difference is when we go to this material view. And of course when we go to render. So let's go again to the camera, and you can click 0 on the numpad to automatically set your view to the camera. And in here, let's click on cycles and click on Eevee. Now immediately we're going to notice some difference, a bit of drop off in quality and some stuff are missing, but we're going to go over that. So now let's try to move in the scene. We can see it's way more responsive, it's pretty nice, basically real time. It might give you a bit lower FPS than this view, but you can see how this does not represent your scene much. It kind of shows you where the model is, kind of shows you some properties of the material, like how shiny it is metallic or not metallic, but not much. But now when you go to cycles, it kind of looks more like we would have like our final product. So you can see the difference here. Now some things are missing, but that does not mean that you cannot add them. So one thing that is missing is screen space reflections. So if we enable this, we can immediately see the difference. And screen space reflections is kind of a compromise, since reflections mean something that is outside of your view can go into the camera. So that will of course be costly for your PC. So what we have to do is kind of fake that, and screen space reflection is kind of faking reflections that are only already rendered in your scene. That means that if something is not rendered, it will not be shown, and we can see it in here, where if I go and hide this light, you can see it from the left, it kind of disappears. That is because it is not rendered. So whatever is already rendered in your screen, it will be reflected in your object. Of course, this is not perfect as reflecting everything that should be reflected, like we have in here. So if I go to cycles, we can see how we have this light reflection in here, but we cannot see it in Eevee. So that's what's happening with screen space reflection. Next would be motion blur, but this is not something that we could see. This is basically when you are rendering. But one important one for visualization would be ambient occlusion. And we can immediately see a difference where now we are casting this ambient occlusion on the floor. We have some ambient occlusion inside here. And this now represents even more this scene. We can see how it's kind of coming together. Still not perfect, but with this view you can generally see how your scene will look like. Next thing that you could enable is bloom, and we can see this works a lot for these lights on the side, but not much for our object because there is not many blown out parts of the object, so nothing is kind of being reflected. You could change the threshold for this if you really want to blow out the scene, but for our purposes we don't need bloom in here since there is nothing that needs to pop out for us. Then you have stuff like subsurface render scattering. This is for skin and the quality of this that you want. But we won't be playing around with this because this object has no like light bouncing inside of it. That does not need to be simulated here. Next thing that you could do is indirect lighting. So one way how Eevee kind of saves on performance is that it mainly uses direct light and then kind of tries to fake everything else. So one thing that you could do in here is let's click Shift A, and you have this light probe and you have radiance volume, which could basically tell you, in this area I want more quality indirect light. Now this scene is not perfect for representing what indirect lighting is, but in general that's the light that bounces multiple times and then comes to the camera. So maybe some piece of light would bounce from here, then maybe here, and then go into the camera, and that is something that you would have to kind of fake in here. So I could try to bake this and try to see. Now I'm not sure if this scene is not the best for representing this, but basically now we should have a bit better indirect lighting. And you can of course change the bounces, stuff like that, and then bake it. So when you bake something, that basically means that it is not real time anymore, so it does not compute it frame per frame, but it is already information that is saved, so you can just pull it out easily. And in here you can change the settings to basically make it more higher quality, but of course you will have to wait longer for baking and stuff like that. And of course if you move anything, the bake will be broken. So if I try to move this, you can see that there is like this little light in here, but yeah, so that the things will be broken. So every time you move something in the scene, you'll have to bake it again if you want to get accurate indirect lighting. Or you can use auto bake, but that might decrease your performance when you're moving stuff, because every time it will try to bake it again, basically. So that's about it for our Eve. Now let's go to cycles. So for cycles, how this works is that basically we're just bouncing lights all around the scene and then catching anything that hits the camera and basically show that. And you can see that in the quality. We can see that our lights is caught properly, or our reflections are caught properly. Then we have this ambient occlusion. So if we go back to Eve, we can see how this ambient occlusion is more screen space than anything else. That means that only what's shown on the screen will show the ambient occlusion, but you can see that it's kind of missing in here. The quality is not the best, but in here we see the smoothness, we see how it goes behind, stuff like that, and it is way more accurate. But of course it gets way more expensive also. We can also see these path tracing samples in here, and this will increase the quality. So for viewport, maybe we can do something like 64, and this is good that it will just give us up to 64 quality, and then it will stop rendering. So you can kind of save resources if you don't need some super crazy quality. I can also do maybe like, let's try 16. It will be really low quality, but when we move, we can see it's still okay quality. We can still kind of see stuff, but it's not that sharp. We can see noise in here. So depends on what you want. Let's do 128. Depends on what you want. You can change samples, and then your viewport will update accordingly. Now we can see how we get, or maybe it's not that visible on stream, but there is less noise in general in the scene. And this is good for reflective objects or rooms where there is only a small source from where the light could come from. So then there needs to be more lighting, more rays cast to kind of represent the scene properly. So yeah, that's about it for Eevee's cycles. I would usually use cycles when I'm a bit deeper into development. Eevee is good for starting out. You can easily preview stuff. It will give you pretty good representation of how your scene will look like. And then when you're a bit deeper into development, you can start using cycles to, from time to time, see how your scene looks like.